great to be with you. Just a bit of a framing of the weekend. So today, not so much a Bible talks, but tomorrow responding from Scripture as to some of the things we're looking at. So we want to lean into being the bad guys. This is the first book I wrote, Being the Bad Guys, How to Live for Jesus in a World That Says You Shouldn't. I wrote that about 4 years ago, and then I've written Futureproof since. And I want to lean into how do we get into the situation that it feels culturally quite difficult being a Christian in the current context. But even in the 4 years since I wrote the first and wrote the second, there's been green shoots, I think, for gospel conversations that I didn't anticipate. I think there's great opportunity, even though we are somehow seen as a little bit the bad guys in the Christian culture. And what I mean by the bad guys is Christianity used to be seen as part of the solution to where we were going culturally. And for a while it sort of dropped off where some of the things we think and believe are seen as problematic in the world. And I took the term from this movie called Falling Down about this guy William, who ostensibly starts the day off as a good guy. And he ends up doing some really bad things during the day, to the point that at the end of his day, where he had ostensibly gone off to work in the morning, he's standing on the edge of Venice Pier on Venice Beach in California, and the police are putting a gun on him. And one of the police officers says, "Come in, William. There's some police officers here who want to talk to you. They're good guys." And this look comes across his face as he's standing there. He goes, "You mean I'm the bad guy? How did that happen?" As a pastor of a church over a couple of decades, that kind of summed up some of the people coming to me going, "I thought as a Christian that we were sort of the good in the culture, but the more I see things and people talk about it, we got to be the bad guys with a lot of stuff. How did that happen?" And part of why I wrote Being the Bad Guys was, how do we explain what it means to be Christian in a context where the second question people ask you about something might be the one that trips you up? "Oh, you're a Christian." You go, "I hope they ask me, do I believe in dinosaurs?" They generally don't now. They ask you, "So what do you think about gay marriage?" Or "What do you think about..." They ask you all the hard questions. You go, "I don't want to answer that question." And you've got this idea that on Church on Sunday, Lyndon, or maybe not Lyndon, well, so here's how you have that conversation around the water cooler at work on Monday. And for 20 or 30 years, we had prepared our people in our churches to have the water cooler conversation on Monday. And that started to get harder because some of the questions we were being asked meant people thought, "I think you can smile and be nice and all that, but underneath you're just some sort of bigot about all these issues." And life changed a lot in that sense for us. We thought, how did that happen? And so I want to quote a great American philosopher, poet at this point, who had something to say about this, and that's Mike Tyson. And he said, "Everyone's got a plan until they get a punch in the mouth." And we've always got a great evangelism plan until you go, "Well, I think you're bigoted because," or "I think you shouldn't be allowed to say that in the culture today." And part of the issue is that as Christians, we believe the gospel and we believe who Jesus is and why he came, but Jesus is our saviour. But the Bible also teaches that he's our creator. And we've got a big issue, which we'll talk about in the second session, around anthropology, what it means to be human in our culture. Who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what a human is for? And they're the likely questions that you're going to get hit with when people start to talk about what you Christians believe about these things. Now, I will put it at this point, I don't think it's gone in a little different direction to how I thought it might go, but we'll talk about that in the second section. But one of the key ones that showed me a little bit of this was, does anyone remember Guy Mason speaking on Sunrise Church about the Andrew Thorburn being president of Essendon Football Club for how many days? 1. Andrew Thorburn, the guy in the middle of that picture, was the chief executive officer of the National Australia Bank, who rolled out all of their diversity policies. But when he became chief executive officer at Essendon Football Club, it was found out that he went to Guy Mason, in the light blue shirt, his church. And they found sermons, and not only that, he was the chair of the board of the church. They found sermons from 10 years ago around issues of end of life, start of life, around abortion, around middle of life, sexuality, marriage, and it went it blew up. And there were people saying, how can he be the chief executive officer of an organisation which is about diversity when his church is so bigoted on so many things? So David Koch on Sunrise brought in Guy Mason to ask him questions about it. And I kind of, texted Guy the day before, said, all the best, hope it goes well. It's TV, you never know what happens. Well, I used to watch Doctor Who when I was young, the early stuff when it was scary, and I'd be hiding behind the couch like this. That's what it felt like, as Guy was basically beaten up by David Koch on air. You Christians, and Guy said, well, Jesus is all about life and love, which is a great slogan for your church sort of evangelism launch, but it didn't cut the mustard on public television when David Koch says, no, he's not, or your church isn't, because look at the stuff your church preaches. And what we thought was normal preaching about normal issues in ethics suddenly blew up. And it was kind of, it was a battle. But here's the thing, the people running the media don't really understand Christians at the same level, because obviously the next Sunday, everyone from The Age and all the newspapers piled in cars and drove down to Guy Mason's church to see what it was like. And the report started with, they wear jeans and leather jackets. I'm going, what do you expect? Amish in a buggy with, that's normal life. But there's this huge disconnect between what the everyday person thought about Christianity, because they didn't have much experience of it, and everyday Christians, in a context where fewer and fewer people are going to church. Christianity's kind of slowly shrinking across the Western world. So the question really is, how do we get here? What's been going on in our culture? What's changed? And look, I'm going to skip through a few of these slides, but I'm going to send them to Lyndon anyway, and you can use them for other things. It's just probably too much. But Carl Trueman, I interviewed Carl Trueman the other week, who's written some great books about where we're at culturally. And I'm going to read a quote that he said, and I'm going to explain it, because it's an interesting quote. It's from his book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Has anyone got that book? Has anyone read that book? Has anyone started to read that book and got 2 chapters in and gone, gee, that's a hard book to read. I wish he'd come out with a shorter version of it, which he did. Anyway, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self and Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism and the Road to Sexual Freedom. And Carl Trueman says this, the intuitive moral structure of our modern social imaginary, wow, I think I say that all the time, right, don't you? That simply means the water we swim in. What's it like in the goldfish bowl of the Western world as you're swimming around and you don't realise the water you're swimming in? The water we swim in the West, prioritises victimhood, sees selfhood in psychological terms, regards traditional sexual codes as oppressive and life-denying, and places a premium on the individual's rights to define his or her own existence. Let me explain. The water we swim in prioritises people whose voices weren't heard for a long time because they weren't part of the mainstream culture. And it's not your voice. You're not a victim. That's what the culture is saying. No matter if there's 2% of you as a minority who go to evangelical churches, this building is in the main street of town with other churches. You got a voice. And other people, especially sexual minorities and other groupings, didn't get a voice. So shut up, people, and listen. And evangelism is part of the problem. You need to be quiet. That's the tone. But it also sees selfhood in psychological terms. And I'm going to explain this, that my wife is a clinical psychologist. And she sees lots of different people, Christian and non-Christian. But 50 years ago, if you had said, I'm physiologically male, but I psychologically feel female, the job of a clinician was to shift your psychology to your physiology. What way is it now? It's the other way around. Why? Because the modern world is a psychological age. Who you are is who you think you are internally. And so it doesn't matter what your physiology does. But we don't believe that as Christians. We believe you're a joined-up person and how that works. And it can be broken, but we do believe we're joined up. So that also meant that if you want to damage someone badly, it's words that damage more than anything else. And guess what our primary mode of telling people the gospel is? It isn't interpretive dance. It's words. And so speaking words about Jesus to people, where Guy Mason, for example, would say Jesus is all about life and love, David Koch will come and say, but look at the words you say in your sermons about what life is about. They're psychologically dangerous to people. And you go, oh, I didn't think that. And they go, of course you didn't think that, because you're not a victim. It regards traditional sexual codes as oppressive and life-denying simply means that how we live our lives today, in how we do marriage life in the church and how the Bible talks about relationships is seen as something that stops you being your true self. And that is problematic in our culture. And obviously that came up through the ranks of, philosophy over the last 500 years, or 300 years probably. But not everyone's reading philosophy from the last 300 years, but they are watching Disney. They are watching Will and Grace. They're watching all the popular culture stuff that just imbibes us with these things. Because we place a premium on the individual's rights to define their own existence. That's critical to understanding what age we're in. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you is an interesting one, because it shows how that plays out. And this is almost 10 years old now, so I think things have even changed a little bit from this point. And that's Caitlyn Jenner. And Caitlyn Jenner, who was Bruce Jenner, decided that they would live true to themselves, their inner selves. It was on the front. Caitlyn Jenner, as Bruce Jenner, was the gold medal winner in the decathlon in the 1976 Montreal Olympics, Man of the Year, and within 40 years was Woman of the Year for Vanity Fair magazine. The same person. Because your identity isn't it's in who you think you are. And this was said in Vice magazine the morning after Caitlyn Jenner was interviewed and promoted in Vanity Fair. The moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, once in every American generation comes a moment that changes the world forever. For millennials, that moment came last night. How did Bruce Jenner, identifying as Caitlyn Jenner, change the world in the same level as the moon landing and the fall of the Berlin Wall? Here's how. The moon landing is the baby boomer moment, right? Apparently. I don't know, any baby boomers here? Wake up. Yeah, sorry. It's hot, I know, it's the afternoon, and I'm being cheeky now. The truth is out there. The truth's out there, and we're going to go and find it. We're going to go out there. And you see the moon landing in 1969, you get Star Trek. Star Trek wasn't about discovering something about aliens. It was about discovering something about humans by interacting with what's out there, truth. And that kind of soured, I think, the post-Nixon era. And then the fall of the Berlin Wall was the X-Gen type. Any X-Gens here? Yeah. No one hates us as much as we hate ourselves, actually. It's true. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was we are the world, we are the children, all the barriers will break down, and that hasn't worked. It feels more tribal now than ever, doesn't it? So whereas the truth isn't out there or across here, the one locus of truth that you can discover is within yourself. It makes sense for millennial generation, and it's shifted a little bit in the next couple of generations, that if you want to find truth, you search within yourself, which makes sense for Caitlyn Jenner to express themselves the way they are. And you think, well, we're not Christian anymore, what's going on? Not so quick. Tom Holland, now this is where I'm coming into, if you're under a millennial, you're thinking Spider-Man, okay? Who's thinking Spider-Man? Tom Holland, the historian, said, he's not a Christian. Oh, well, he's on the way, even since I wrote my first book. He's an historian, and he said, I don't know if I believe that the resurrection is true, but the Christians did, and they changed the world because of it, because of the resurrection. Well, changed the world because of the resurrection, because of the power of the Holy Spirit. But you get what I'm saying. And he said, even though we're not Christian in the West anymore, he says the West is still firmly tied to its Christian moorings. What he means by that is that if you're a non-Christian in the West today, you're non-Christian in a very Christian way. And he said, the proof of that is in history. If you went back before Jesus and the church, pagan Rome was not into human rights. Forgiveness was not critical in that era. The individual had no internal inherent worth. It wasn't the way the world operated. He said the person who would go back in a time machine, and we'll get to a time machine in the second session, to pagan first century Rome would realise how Christian they were, even in their opposition to Christianity. Glenn Scrivener's book, The Air We Breathe, talks about the very framework of human rights that is used often to say you Christians are wrong is a Christian idea. It feels like the tools we created are being used against some of the things we believe. That's what makes it complex in the Western world. It isn't going back to pre-Christianity. It's going to a post-Christian thing that's very different, that takes the things that it assumes about the world. Human rights are just obvious. No, they're not. Christianity gave us a lot of them. And says, we'll have those without the Jesus bit. Mark Sayers from Melbourne has a book called Disappearing Church. And he talks about first culture was pagan culture. He said second culture was like Christian culture in the West. And he said you can believe lots of great things about pop culture and have ideas about intellectual frameworks, but he said your belief in the second culture values of faith, specifically around the exclusivity of Jesus and what it means to be human in what you do with your body, will see you viewed as beyond the pale. You can be the hippest church you want, but if they find out that you're orthodox on your views of sexuality or how you get to know God, you're done. So don't get hipper, he says. I mean, could you? I don't know. But he said, well, we had this battle that we've got to be culturally relevant, but the gospel issue at the moment is we've got to be gospel resilient. And my experience is that when I preach or speak about some of these issues, I get a lineup of parents afterwards, slightly teary, saying, my daughter or my son used to be Christian, and then they went to uni, and now they have no framework of what, and they're living with their partner, or they've rejected the gospel, or they've decided that they're gay, or whatever it is. They say, how do we put this together? It feels complex. Now, I'll show you an example of how the language we have of thinking about where the future's going is taken up in our cultural moment. This is Ros Ward, who created the Safe Schools Coalition material that was rolled out in Australia a few years ago for anti-bullying, ostensibly, but underneath that was a whole idea of sexuality, etc., that was coming out into it. It was very strongly opposed by lots of jurisdictions, but she said, I will never give up fighting for a more free and joyful world. And she's an atheist. And I thought, there are words, a free and joyful world. Where did she get the idea that there's a free and joyful world coming from? Well, she got it from Christianity, because it isn't baked into the human experience in other places around the world. The Roman Empire thought that the great world was behind it, in the golden age of the gods and the heroes. And the Eastern philosophical framework of the world doesn't see a future coming, it's just got this big cycle of life. Or the circle of life, as a Disney movie might put it. Christians believe there's a free and joyful world coming because Jesus died, rose from the dead, is ruling the world and is coming back to bring salvation and judgment and sort it out. And Ros Ward doesn't believe any of that, but it's baked into her, the air she breathes, that there's a future coming that could be good. So it's very hard to navigate that as a Christian when someone else who, opposed to everything you believe, is fighting for a free and joyful world alongside you for diametrically opposed perspectives. That's the West we live in. Look, I'll move along to a couple more slides. I'll move on to the next one. This is a book called Sex in the I World by Dale Kuhn. He talks about the age of authenticity that we live in. And the I world is the I world, right? And he compares it to the T world, the traditional world. And he said, in the traditional world, that often is still there in many cultures, but was in the West, life was built around relationships of what he calls mutual obligation. You could break your relationship obligations, but it would be at high cost. And he said the I world is about relationships of personal choice. So it makes sense that marriage can be between anyone who makes personal choice. It's a different way of looking at the world. It's not about mutual obligation. It's about my most romantic partner who's going to fulfill who I am inside. And here's the other thing. If I decide who I am inside chafes against who that person is I'm married to, the most authentic thing I can do is be myself and do what I wish. That's an interesting framework for how we're putting the world together. I'll skip through a few of these as we go. So Mark Sayers talks about the kingdom without the king. Now, the fruit of the gospel, or the human rights thing, people say, we'll have that, but we don't want Jesus. We're not interested in that bit. We like the other stuff. But there's an increasing, interesting response to that from the hard secular right, politically, which is, I guess, where are we? Christendom without Christ. I love that picture, even though it scares me, of Notre Dame burning. That it's very possible to say, we want the traditions of the 1940s and 50s, but we don't really need Jesus. We just want to be conservative culturally. I don't think that's going to work out as well as we think it will. Because there's all this stuff going on this progressive side of life, and there's always going to be a pendulum swing. And that's what we've experienced a little bit as we've gone through things. And surprisingly, and we talked about it, one of the people who was promoting that was Andrew Tate. It becomes about power. Andrew Tate is very much someone who young men were just lapping up his ideas. Now, I think it's moved on since I even wrote about this, but I'll talk about that in the next section. But what does it feel like as a Christian in the modern world? I think it feels like an away game. It used to feel like a home game when this building was built, and perhaps even when you were younger. Not you young people, it's always been an away game. But you know the difference between an away game and a home game? Yeah, this is a football. I mean, I support Arsenal. I don't support any of the Australian codes. But if I'm at Arsenal's home ground to watch a match, I can go to the local pub and stand on the table and sing songs and fight and get away with it, right? Not that I would do that. There's other people. I'd never do that. But if I go up to Manchester City and their home ground as an Arsenal supporter, it's an away game. And I know it. Because I don't jump up on the table because it's not my home ground. It's a different stance. And they know it's their home, and you're not. And I think that is where Christians are struggling at the moment. This is an away game territory at some level culturally, and it's very easy to get angry at an away game. Why can't I stand on the table? You know, because it's not a home game. You've got to come to it from a slightly different stance culturally. The way you talk into a conversation, just because you're a Christian, no longer gives you a right to say anything as authoritative because you're a Christian. It doesn't cut the same weight. And I think that's what's going on. That's the issue we're dealing with. And I'll go through a few more. This one here. In 2016, you could tick not religious anymore. Well, you could tick no religion on your census for years, but in 2016 the concerted campaign was not religious anymore. It wasn't not religious, it was not religious anymore. Do you remember that time, Lyndon, when you were religious and you had to go to church in pews and staying, oh yeah, here we go, and wear itchy pants and, oh man, but you know what, you don't have to do that anymore and you can still be a good Australian. You don't have to send your kids, you don't have to get married there, you don't have to do any of that stuff. And 900,000 extra people ticked no religion in 2016, and 900,000 extra people in 2021 ticked no religion. 1.8 million. Now, it doesn't mean that last Sunday they were at church singing songs to Jesus and, teaching kids ministry, and then the next census came out and, I'm Jack of this. It's like they were 1.8 million people who had an air of that we might be, but we're not anymore. And Australia doesn't need to be, and it's not transgressive. And that's where decline comes. Nominalism, as we call it. And the flip side to that was something that I felt is where some people were still struggling. There was this one: we don't go to church but still have Christian values. We're writing Christian. And I struggled with that. One of the primary Christian values is turning up to church every week, right? Gathering with the people of God. I don't think that's acceptable, because they're hard people to reach for the gospel because they think they're good. We have Christian values. Of course you do. You live in the Western world. So does Ros Ward, even though you wouldn't agree with her politically, socially, sexually, or whatever. But she's believing in a joyful and free world, and so are you, because of Christianity. Which really brings the question, where's it all going? That's where you get the DeLorean sports car. From Back to the Future, everyone, surely Back to the Future, yeah? I got that one right. No, I've come from Northern Ireland. You know they built the DeLorean sports cars in Belfast. And we used to drive past the DeLorean sports car, and there was No, it was not. That was not true. There was 500 unwanted, unsold DeLorean sports cars rusting in the rain of Northern Ireland because it was a terrible car. No one wanted them. And but where is it all going? And we'll look at that in the next session. I'll stop in about 5 minutes because I want some questions before we go into the second session. I think what we're living in at the moment is this. This is our moment. It's a roller coaster. And here's the thing about a roller coaster, you just don't know where it's going next. It felt like 4 years ago when I wrote that book, it was going to go, shh, no one is interested in Christianity, and another 900. Who knows? But here's what I do know, that most of a progressive modern way of looking at history over the last couple of hundred years said, strap yourself into the progressive narrative of leave religion behind, science and progress and reason will put us on a cable car to a great future that looks a bit like the Jetsons, a cartoon series. And if you strap yourself into what you think's a cable car ride to the top of Progressive Mountain, and you suddenly end up on a roller coaster where you don't know where the next war is coming from, what technology is going to do, if anyone even believes anything anymore, and there's no meaning and purpose, you'll get sick. The cultural anxiety we're going through is because no one knows what's coming next, and they're scared of it. Can we keep going in these different directions? That's the moment we're living in. Who knows? And so many of the things that we're struggling with are around that issue. People who are not Christian are asking all sorts of questions. And look, I'll finish this section just very briefly by what I think is actually, where is the next one I want to go to? This, not my son, but my son does love skating. And what if you learn to skate, all right, you've got to go to the skate park and you get onto the, where you're going to drop in. And what are you supposed to do to drop in, con skaters? How do you do it? You've got to stamp your foot down on the board and lean down in. What do you do when you're standing at the top of this chasm? Lean back, don't you? And what happens? You fall off. I think one of the things we thought as Christians is maybe the strategy is to just lean back a little bit and dial it down. I say counterintuitively, as my son found out when he started to stamp his foot down, if you lean in, it's going to be much better for us going forward as God's people. That somehow being more distinct in a time when to be distinct as Christians can get you a lot of heat is probably what we want to do. Because too many times our strategy would be, how do we lean in to be the same as everyone else? Keep our heads down, and I would say lean into difference. Lean into difference. What does it mean to have a totally different perspective on the world? Because I want to be able to say to people who come to speak to me about Christianity, I'm not going to tell you that the world you're living in is all there is, and I'm not going to tell you that Jesus is just going to give you a pat on the head and tidy you. He's going to blow your world apart. Because your categories for understanding the world aren't the Christian ones. So a great book to read on this is Rory Shiner and Peter Orr's book, The World Next Door, A Short Guide to the Christian Faith. And they talk about the creed, the ancient creeds. The Apostles' Creed allows you to understand Christianity. And they say the creed allows us to take you in and show you around a bit, rather than just standing at the door and talking about what's on the other side. Their claim is that people don't have any clue as to what Christianity is about today. You've got to almost explain the little bits to them. But here's an interesting thing about the book. It doesn't start with the creed. It starts with the story of Jesus casting the demons out of Legion in a graveyard into pigs who fall into the ocean and drown. Anyone want to sign up? And do you know why? Because if someone can't come to the Christian faith and realise there's a heaven above and a hell below and an earth in the middle, and these things leak, that things move between them, they'll never understand what the Bible's about and what Christianity's about. You can't take the Christian message and just plant it onto a modernist sensibility of how things have been put together. It's got to explode your categories. My experience as a Christian is that I say that to people, people are intrigued by that difference. And part of that's because they were built to believe it and they've suppressed it. The last two Olympics, do you know what one of the theme songs has been? Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. It's not easy to imagine there's no heaven. You have to throw a lot of other stories at you and a lot of white goods and holidays to get the idea of heaven out of your heads. It's hard to. And at the moment we're in a cultural crisis moment that people are starting to say there's got to be something more than this. Now I'll finish on this and we'll go to some questions. But I think we need to lean into the difference in Christianity. This is a girl called Tara Isabella Burton, and she was one of those crazy out there, she says, pagan, white witch, Wicca ladies who writes New York Times bestsellers, and now she's a conservative Roman Catholic, so something happened in her life, right? And she says she just realised the figure of Jesus was the most compelling person she had seen. But she says this, and I think it's true as we finish this session, we don't have to explain away miracles or fit them into the modern scientific system, but actually embrace the strangeness of these ideas. We've been spending a lot of time in the last 50 years trying to convince people that we're just as normal as they are, and no one's normal, right? We're just sensible. And I go, no, we're not. We believe there's a heaven above and a hell below and the earth in the middle and they leak and Jesus rose from the dead. And the craziest thing you believe isn't that two men can't get married. It's that one day you'll be standing on the floor 15 of the office block and you'll open the window and Jesus will peel the sky back and appear. Security, get them out of here. That's crazy stuff, but if it weren't true. But I think the next 50 years of Christianity, you can lean into the difference. You can lean into the strangeness. You don't have to explain away the miracles. You say that's something that God has brought in, intervening. You know what? Already on television, in our news morning sunrise programs, they're bringing the horoscopes back in. It's not as if people have left Christianity and become sensible. That's not happened. And the reason for that is because we're spiritual. It just is. Now, we do finish this at 2, don't we? So it would be great to have questions, comments, brickbats. I've got security somewhere who can drag you out if you ask me really hard questions. But do you want to have a few questions?
Do you want to give people a minute to compose themselves? Maybe chat about a question.
That's a good idea.
Exactly 1 minute. We'll come back and throw questions in.
Yeah. Okay, folks. Any questions? Have we got a question? I see that hand. The young lad in the middle there. I say young. Everyone starts to look young to me from this age. Everyone.
Okay. So you were saying that 70 years ago, let's say, the West was sort of a home ground for Christians. If that was the case, why wasn't everyone a Christian then? And why are there so few Christians around from that time?
Yeah, it's good. They were the non-Christians were not Christian in a kind of Christian way. So the prevailing framework was, I don't want to go, I don't want to, but I know what the moral framework is, and I will transgress it. But I know that that's roughly the way the moral universe is put together in the West. So it wasn't that everyone was going to church. The great irony is more people percentage-wise go to church today in America than did 150 years ago. But the prevailing air was much more Christian air. And you know that because when they did have census data, everyone who wasn't a Christian ticked Christian because it was a home game. You could still go to church maybe 50 years ago as someone who ran a business, knowing that going there would actually give you kudos. Not now. So they didn't believe, the gospel, weren't saved, but they kind of said the pastor or the church people were the good living people, and we're just not living up to that necessarily, in the West at least. Now, obviously there are all sorts of other issues, and one of the things I think's worth in some discussions is, people are saying, well, back in the 50s or 60s, yeah, we know what Christianity was about. It was blacks on the back of the bus in America. It was about lack of civil rights. It was all these things. It was about Indigenous issues here. So there's plenty to answer for and plenty to talk about. But we were not Christian back then, if they were, in a kind of Christianised way. And that's changed, I think, since the sexual revolution. Good question. Anyone else? Here we go.
Could you just make a comment on the rise of Islam in the West?
Yeah.
And what's that going to be? How's that going to play out? That's
a good question. Lyndon and I were talking about the other rise is Stoicism, right? So the Stoics. Something about Islam is highly structured and metered and coolly distant enough from God and able to be, I think in one sense, some of the moral stuff can be circumvented, but it's a monolithic structure. Because what are we looking for in our culture at the moment? Order. So what you're going to get is an interest in Islam, and you're going to get an interest in fascism, I think, and everything in between. But I think Islam, as I speak to young Muslims, the guy who cuts my beard in Perth is a young Muslim, so when the first time he's shaving my neck, he said, "What do you do for a living?" And I went, but I have a friend who's an expert and is fluent in Arabic, and he said it's highly attractive because it allows you to tick boxes without necessarily being transformed, but it's very ordered and metered. And it's got an allure to the West because it's mysterious at some level. And we also have a rose-coloured idea of what it actually looks like when people come. Oh, it's a great food van down there with, hang on, that's not what Islam does around the world. You do know that's different. So I think the West has got a different version of Islam in its brain, but it does have a metered orderedness to it that is attractive to people who are looking for order. I think order is an issue in our culture at the moment. Not the only thing, but I think it's part of it. Another question? Front? Yeah. Maya.
I think you were mentioning about how you were commenting on how the world has become a psychological world, and how we understand ourselves is through the internal beliefs. And I think you made a few remarks about how that has already moved on a bit since that idea came out. Would you mind just elaborating on how you think the world, our society has shifted even since then?
Yeah, well, I still think we're a psychological age, but in order to demonstrate that, for example, think of who's the conservative transgender person in the world at the moment? It's Caitlyn Jenner, horrified by how women's sport is going, goes to church regularly, in order, even 10 years ago, in order to show that you were a woman trapped inside a man's body, you would change your body. You don't have to do that now. You can look how you like and so identify it. Because what it's done is when you break the binary nature of it, you don't just switch to another kind of, it just floats off into a million pieces. So what you're getting is, I think the trans issue is about transhumanism ultimately. That the hope we seem to have in our culture is we could all be uploaded to a great web in the sky, cloud, to loose ourselves from the surly bonds of this body that keeps letting us down. How do you get rid of racism? Well, you be in a system where no one would know your race or your gender or whatever, because you'd be a psychological self. There is pushback though, and I think what you're finding is people are going, there's got to be something that's more holistic for us as human beings. So 70 years ago, you would have been laughed out of the psychiatric department if you'd said you could be a different person inside to who you were outside, because they didn't believe there was somehow, a spirit poured into you. It was material. And then it became there's two different me's. I think we're trying to figure out how to move to the joined up one at the same time that we're seeing no boundary at all as to what we look like. But bad ideas don't work forever. So I think the pushback we're getting is because people are saying there's no stability, there's nothing stable. And you'd see it in first, second, third and fourth wave feminism and how they've moved as well. That the person who you thought was most critical of Christianity and its framework, J.K. Rowling, is now beyond the pale. Why? Because she has a stable framework and everything else is highly unstable, shape-shifting all the time. That can't sustain itself, and it will swing back to, well, I compare it, the trans movement versus the trad wife movement, for example. You know what I mean by that, the trad wives? The younger ladies here will explain that to the congregation later, because it's too hard. Just go and look it up, and you'll see there's a pushback. So what you're getting is a polarised culture. People are vacating the middle, and most people are just trying to keep their heads down. Because it's a hot culture, isn't it? You get cancelled at the drop of a hat. Yeah. One more? Yeah. A couple more.
I was just wondering why all of these small groups that are opposing the normal, why is everyone so angry just for an opinion? Like, there's always a pushback, there's always calling names, there's just because you've said your stance, which doesn't hurt anyone.
A couple of things. You used the word normal and that triggers me. No. You said just because you've said? See? Yeah, it's okay. Who was that on the phone angry at me? Someone. Words are violence now in a psychological age. So you saying that is what we call a microaggression, which you can't recognise it, A university department can pick a microaggression at 1,000 feet, but, anti-Semitism, never saw it, on campus, whatever. So there's stuff going on. But there's a reason for that. Because what I said about the victim framework, the Jewish framework is not seen as victim. It's seen as oppressor, or it's pitched that way. That's how it works. But people are angry too, because here's the other thing. We wanted to get rid of the idea of a vengeful God, and we did, but you don't get rid of vengeance, you just outsource it to ourselves. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord, I will repay. But if you don't believe that, it's got to go somewhere. So I think we're a very confused culture. Social media doesn't help that, because I can be angry at you terribly until I have to see you face to face, and that might shift me in my thinking a little bit. And I think that's been an interesting one on the abortion debate, that ultrasound is so impressive that you can see a baby early. It changes the nature of how these things work, because you can see the person. Very different. Once you can see the person, rather than, Boomf, send. I think that's part of it. We're done, are we? One more, was there? I'll try to make this answer so blindingly brilliant in about 10 seconds.
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, another question
no.
first, yeah.
Look, I would like you to comment on something that has disturbed me a lot lately. We had a murder in the Western Downs, which is about 4 hours away from here, of 2 policemen and a neighbour. Oh, you've heard of it?
The trains, yeah.
Yeah. So I've heard twice on TV news it was Christian terrorism. Other times it's been called just religious extremists or conspiracy theorists. Could you make some comment on sort of, you know, what do we say, what do we think about those kind of things?
Christian terrorism sounds like oxymoron, like, you know, political intelligence, right? They might say this is Christianised thinking on some stuff, but that's not how Jesus would live. But I also think there's a political way of saying, well, if there's Islamic terrorism, well, we're going to show you where there's hard right-wing Christian terrorism. It was conspiracy theory nonsense, right? Christians aren't afraid of the truth. But we also shouldn't be afraid to say if someone was a Christian and did a terrible thing, that was a terrible thing, just because they're not in our tribe. Jesus is our focus and locus of what's right and wrong. And if a Christian does something like that, our first instinct is, well, if I say that was terrible, we'll get a pile-on. We're going, no. Christians are at liberty among anyone on the planet to go, I got it wrong. Because I don't need to self-justify, because I'm justified by Jesus. And if you live in a culture in which you're not justified by Jesus and you don't know anything about Jesus, you have to constantly self-justify, and that's a tiring experience. And it feels like social media pylons mean I've got to double down even if I know I'm wrong. So I would say the media's always going to say it's this, and most people go, no, it wasn't. You know, they were just a bunch of nasty nutters who did terrible things. But I do think the media likes the polarised, it's Christian terrorism, it's Islamic terrorism, it's what... And I go, that's not how reality plays out. So, but I would also say, if Jesus would not live like that, and did not live like that, does not call his followers to live like that, that's not Christian. I think that's what I would be saying. We're good? Yeah, thanks.
Just want to thank Steve.